We're going to just look at one verse. I'm going to look at that in just a moment. In Esther this morning, I preached on a message, so lucky or so blessed. So lucky or so blessed. And we talked about, things happen by chance and coincidence and good luck and bad luck. Those terms that we used oftentimes. And when we reference those type of words, we're really taking God out of the equation. It's an atheistic response because if we say, boy, that was lucky. But we're not, it's not luck, we're blessed. And so if we're blessed by God, then that means that God is worthy of our recognition of appreciation, gratitude, focus on serving Him and following Him. If it's just luck or chance, then there's no reason to be grateful or thankful. And so we learned this morning many examples in the Bible about Ahab being killed by that sort of member at a venture. He pulled a random soldier, pulled back the bow, and just sort of at a venture shot the last arrow he had in his quiver. Had no idea where it was going to go, just up in the air. But God, in His providence, took that arrow and brought it exactly to the person that needed to go to in fulfillment of Micaiah's prophecy that said, Ahab, if you don't get right with God, you're going to die in this battle. And sure enough, that arrow, when he was disguised, had an armor on. It pierced the joint of the armor, went through the little seam of the armor, and went in and did a lethal blow. And Ahab was killed as a result of that shot. Just sort of a coincidence. What's the odds of that? We talked about Pharaoh's daughter going down to the Nile River at this time, at this place, at this hour, and there just so happened to be a little baby in a bulrush by the name of a little ark, a little boat that she had built, by the name of Moses, baby Moses. The babies were not allowed to be alive at that time. Every child under the age, I think 2 or 3 years of age, was to be killed, and so of a Hebrew woman, and so they took this little baby, didn't want him to be kept. They kept him for 3 months, the Bible says, and then they hid him away in this bulrush. Well, what's the odds that Pharaoh's daughter comes down, Moses' older sister, I sort of picture like Bella, because she sort of has that ornery look on her face, and she's sort of looking through the ivy over there, looking through the grass, and she sees Pharaoh's daughter come down, Bella, and then all of a sudden she shows up, knowing that's her little brother, and says, and the Pharaoh's daughter says, we need someone to nurse this child. Obviously, I'm not able to do that, and Moses' sister said, well, I can find a Hebrew nurse that can help raise up the child, or you feed the child. Obviously, who that nurse was? The mom of Moses. And so what's the odds of that? Moses was reared by his own mom in his own home, and when all his other people around that area were killed that were born at that time, what a coincidence that took place. And we talked about Joseph, and all the events that took place in his life. And what they thought for evil, God meant it, what? For good. God meant it. So what are the odds of that? What a coincidence. And so we talked about the details. God's in all the various details of our life. Some of them are good, some of them are bad, but God's working all that according to His plan. Now, the book of Esther is an interesting book. Esther is unique because as you study, Esther is the only book in the Bible, 66 books in the Bible. It's the only book of the Bible where God's name cannot and is not found. You will not find the name of God in the book of Esther. Now, God's presence is on every page of the book of Esther, but His name is nowhere to be found, which raised the question, why would God include in His Word a book that's a great story? I mean, it's a great story, Esther, and the whole process that took place about the Jews. Why would He, though, put a book in the Bible that doesn't reference Himself, that doesn't, mention the name of God and God's presence? The reason is that God wanted to teach us something about Himself that is critical for your life and mine if we're going to be able to make it through those difficult and trying and challenging times of our life. It's vital that we catch a vital truth about who God is as we study the book of Esther. There are many times in our circumstances when we look for God, but He cannot be located. He cannot be found. As Job said, well, I looked to the right, and I looked to the left, and I looked in front of me, and this and that. Where is God? And God just can't be found. There are some times in our lives when it seems that God is letting things happen to us that He wouldn't allow if He loved us and cared about us. And He doesn't seem to be present when these painful circumstances are going on in our life. But there's a term in the Bible that talks about God's invisibility and God's presence when He cannot be seen. God's presence when He cannot be felt. God's presence when He cannot be observed. And that invisibleness of God is called the providence of God. God working behind the scenes. And we see what's on the stage. And boy, what a production and what an event that's taking place. But there's a lot of stuff going on, rushing around behind the curtain, behind the scene of what's going on. And so it's referred as the doctrine of providence. God's unseen hand at work in the midst of the story of Esther, but also in the midst of the story of your life. In those times when you feel that God is unseen, God is not around, God's nowhere to be evident in your life, that unseen, the covert hand of God, that invisible hand of God is there working, as we see in the story of Esther. It's a book that's filled, overflowing with the providence of God. That unseenness of God, that visibility of God. And so Esther is a book God wanted to use to show us how His providence, how His invisible hand works behind the scenes to bring about His purpose in history. And even though God is not on the front page of Esther, the fingerprints of God are all through the story of Esther. It's everywhere in the story, though the name is not mentioned at all. So even though God is not named in the book of Esther, we look for that invisible, that covert hand of God at work. And so the goal tonight of the message is to help us discern the invisible hand of God at work in your lives when it seems as though God's not present, when it seems as though God's not working, when it seems as though God's not moving, when it just seems like things are stagnant in your life and you're praying, but there's no answer to prayer. You're working, but there's no results to the effort. You're doing everything you should do, but there's just nothing that is visibly evident to your eyes that there's any movement at all in a positive or right direction. And so I want us to learn to be able to discern the invisible hand of God in our lives. Now, when we understand this truth, that God is providentially at work, then you're able to move through life's events with a much more quieter spirit, a much less anxious spirit, a lot less fearful spirit, because you know that God is working behind the curtain. You know that God is working, and I don't see it. I want to feel it. I want to sense it. I want it to be real. But we can trust, and there's a calmness in our heart that says, it's all right. I've got everything under control. The providence of God. Nowhere is God mentioned the name of God in the whole book of Esther. But every aspect, in every detail of this story, I encourage you, maybe in this week or next couple of weeks, just reread through or read it for the first time or reread it again. The story of Esther, you won't find God's name, but you'll see God every bit through that story as you look through it. And so in our lives, as in Esther's narrative, God's silence is too loud to ignore. Let me say that again. As in Esther's story, God's silence in our lives is too loud to be ignored. His absence is too glaring to miss. You can trust Him because He is in control. And that's what Esther's all about. That's why this book has been put in the Bible, not to exalt God and Jehovah and the amazing Almighty One and the Rock and all these great names we hear all through the Bible. It's about staying in a covert position where there's no visible sign of God being involved in the equation. But when we look back and we see the story from our viewpoint, we see every aspect of God involved, the details. So the title of the message tonight is this: the power of divine providence. The power of divine providence. But we'll miss the power that's attached to God's providence if we don't trust the providential, invisible hand of God. When we don't see it, we're going to forfeit the power of God working if we don't see that divine providence at work and trust that divine providence. So providence is often very mysterious. We may not see God's hand at work, but He's that sort of puppet master, if you would, pulling the strings and controlling the actions of either causing or allowing things to happen. And because of this, we can trust God even though we cannot trace His hand at work in our lives. We can know that God is work. Why? Because of the providence of God. He cares, the sovereignty of God. He's all-powerful. He's in control. But the promise of God is the personal details of God's sovereignty that says, I love you, I care about you, and I'm working in your life, in the lives of those that are important to you, that are special and valuable to you. Unsaved loved ones, and we could go on and on in those areas. When we can't see God in our circumstances, we need to remember that there's far more happening than you and I can ever see. And that's what Esther wants us to know. Because we're creatures of what? Sight. Show me, God, what you're doing. Show me, God, how you're moving. But the just shall walk by what? Not by sight, but they'll walk by faith. And so we realize when you see the life circumstances, there's a lot more going on than what we just see. Now, the book of Esther unfolds around Haman's plot. That's the whole storyline, their plot line is Haman's plot. Chapters 1 to 3, the plot is formed. In chapters 4 to 5, the plot is fought. In chapters 6 to 10, the plot is foiled. And that's not the message, but that gives us an outline of that book of Esther. That's a helpful outline, but the book of Esther is not really about the plot. The plot is an integral part of Esther, but it's not the main part of the book. Esther's not even primarily about the plan of Satan to destroy the godly lineage, although that's evident because the lineage of Christ was going to come through this line. And so we see that that's an evident part of the story, but that's not even the main part of the story. The book of Esther, here it is. It's about the God who rules the good and overrules evil. It's about a providence that is greater than any satanic plot. Even when you cannot see Him, even when you cannot hear Him, even when you cannot understand all that He's doing, God is at work in your life and in my life, and we've got to trust that, or we'll limit the power of God that's working in the providential what? Behind the scenes. It's the invisible hand of God at work. Now, it was divine providence. Let's just sort of look at this story that brought Esther to the throne and made her queen. It was divine providence that caused the maids to inform Esther of Haman's plot to kill all the Jews. It was divine providence that gave Esther favor to come before the king. It was divine providence that would not allow the king to sleep in the middle of the night. It was divine providence that led the king to read a book. It was divine providence that very book being read was a book of Chronicles. It was divine providence that the portion read was about Mordecai's faithfulness to the king. It was divine providence had Haman pronounced the promotion of Mordecai, the one man he hated the most. It was divine providence that motivated Haman to build the very gallows on which he would in a short while be hung himself. It was divine providence that turned the table for the Jews. It was divine providence that rescued the entire nation of Israel. It wasn't Esther making it happen. It was God at work behind the scenes. Though she didn't understand it, it didn't make sense from her perspective. God, the invisible hand, was working. The providence of God was at work. Now, in the process of what she was going through, it was just one mishap after another, one delay after another, one this after another, one frustration after another, one discouragement after another. But God, we see the whole story, whole outline, and we see, though God's name is never outlined or mentioned, we see the providence of God. We see the care of God, of the details all through there. Now, there's a grave danger, turned into a great deliverance through the providence of God. The key verse, and this is where I wanted to look at, is in Esther chapter 4. So remain seated, but look at Esther chapter 4, because this is the key verse of the entire book of the book of Esther. And it's in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. So go ahead and turn there if you would. Verse number 14. So God did something amazing. And it wasn't Esther. She was a great servant, a great godly woman. Amen. I'm not denying that. But it was God in the details. It was God working behind the scenes. It was God bringing all those things apart to be a part of the overall story. Here's the key verse. Verse 14, chapter 4. Now this is Mordecai speaking to Esther. And here's what he says. For thou altogether holds thy peace at this time. Then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed, and who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom? No sound, for such a time as this. I want you to meditate or think on that phrase there, for such a time as this. Do you believe that God's timing, that God is a God of perfect timing? We do. And so God allowed, so what's that mean? God's allowed you to live at this exact time in history. Because God is a God of perfect timing. And I wish I lived in this generation. I wish I would have lived in this time. You're living at the perfect time that God wants you to live. In fact, what you're going through and what you've gone through in your life is perfectly coordinated in the details of your life, that you're the one, and I'm the one that had to go through those various details of our life that we got. So God's timing is perfect. God allowed you to live at this exact time. He is allowing you to face what you must face today for such a time as this. This is your time. This is your time. And it may be a rough road you're on right now. It may be a hard battle you're facing right now. It may be a very discouraging time. But it's this time. It's a time as such as this that God has brought you in His perfect timing with this perfect situation and these perfect circumstances. Right now, God's brought you to that place where He wants you to be. He's allowing you to face what you face today by divine plan. So don't be discouraged. Why? His way is perfect. His time is perfect. Why? Our God is a perfect God. And so we realize through the promise of God, remember I said the three key words about providence? Providence was what? Number one, in regards to what? God has wisdom. He always does it sovereign. He's all powerful. Number two, wisdom. He always does what's right. He always does what's best. And then His goodness. He always does what's best for us. So the summary of God's providence is tied to what? He's all powerful. He's not limited to our lack of strength and abilities and talents. He's all powerful. He's wise, which means everything He does good. Everything that's in our lives is good. Now, then we see, number three, He's wise, and then He's, what was the third one I just said? Good. God's good. And so in God's goodness, that means what? Everything that's allowed into our life, it's for my good. It's for me. It's going to be good for me and in my life. And so we see that time and time again. And so now the doctrine of providence, of God's providence, it teaches us several things. I want to help us learn some of those things tonight. Number one, providence is God providing in ways that you do not expect. The providence of God is the way God provides for you in things and ways you do not expect. Now, you don't have to turn there, but write the verse down. Philippians 4:19. But my God shall supply all your need according to your expectations. No, it doesn't say that, right? It says what? But my God shall supply your need according to what? His riches, but His glory, His riches in glory in Christ Jesus. So here's a thought. So providence is God providing in ways we don't expect. Now this is important because a lot of us get a little disillusioned with God because God doesn't do what we expect God to do. And so, but providence is God working. It's mysterious. We don't understand it. If we could see and orchestrate, God, you need to do this right here. And God, it's time for this to happen right here. And God, you do this. Then why do we need God? God does the mysterious. All we trust is that God's working. God's moving in the details of our life, even though I don't see and understand it. And so He works in ways that are unexpected. So God always provides for His children. Always provides for His children. Though often it's not the way we expect and it's not the way we hope. Often. God always provides for us. Always for His children. But oftentimes, that's not the way I was expecting him to provide. I wasn't hoping he'd provide in that way, but God provided. One of the most beautiful aspects of God's provision is that it often comes in ways that we often don't expect. The challenge, though, is for us to see his provision and care even when it arrives differently than we expected. That's important. See, I've got to embrace the fact that God is providential and he's wise. He always does right. He's good. He always does it for my own best interest. And so because of God's providence, God often is going to do things that I don't expect. So the challenge is what? I've got to see the provision of God, the care of God. I've got to see it and recognize it, even when it didn't show up the way I was expecting it to show up. But God still was working in the details, even though it wasn't what I was assuming it was going to happen that way. Because God is God, his ways, Isaiah 55:9, are what? They're higher, right, than our ways. We're not going to understand God. God is always doing 10,000 things, whereas we only recognize 2 or 3 of them. He's not just doing one thing in someone's life. There's 10,000 things that God is doing, and you may see 1 or 2 or 3 of them. And you're thinking, now God, come on, now God, you got to trust. God is working behind the scenes. They got to embrace that. Why? There's a power in the promise of God. That means what? God's working the details of my life, but I can short circuit. I can sabotage the power of God's providence when I begin to limit his power by not trusting that he's working when he's working behind the scenes. But I don't see it. I get discouraged or frustrated and take things in my own hands. And so over and over again, Jesus' disciples missed what Jesus was doing right in front of them. They missed the point of the miracles. They missed the lessons. From our human perspective, we may look for something tangible, something immediate. But God in his infinite wisdom knows what we truly need, and he provides accordingly. And often it's not what we were expecting. But we look back and says, that was just what I needed. I needed that. And I needed that layoff, or I needed that demotion, or I needed that time of humbling, or I needed, and we don't like it at the time, but we look back and says, boy, I needed that. But God knows I'll supply what? All your need, not according to your expectation. I'll provide all your needs according to what his riches. And you got to trust the riches of God's providence and God's care and God's love. Even though you don't see what God's doing, it's not based and doesn't have to meet your expectation. All it has to do is what? Know that God's working. And God often through providence doesn't do it the way I was hoping, the way I was expecting, or the way I was assuming that God would go about and doing. But God always is doing what God always does. So if the provision doesn't come in this way, we're tempted to feel that God didn't uphold his promise. Well, God, you said if I did this, that you do this. And God, I did my part. And God, and so Satan takes how we were expecting God to do something in our prayer being answered, or this situation being cared for, our expectation, whether verbalized or subconsciously, and it didn't go the way we were thinking, we begin to step back and say, well, God, don't you care? Don't you see the effort I'm putting forth and the sacrifice I'm making? Don't you even see what I'm doing? And we begin to tempted. We begin to begin to question God a little bit in those areas. And so we got to understand that God has more than one way to provide. Your way that you're expecting him to provide to meet that need is not the only way that God can meet that need. Now, you think it's the best way. You think it's the right way. You think it's the only way. But God says, I'll take that in consideration, but I got a better way I'm going to meet that need, because I'm just not looking at meeting the need in a singular way. I'm looking at meeting a need in a multifaceted way. Because there's a lot more at place that God's working on than just this one thing you want. There's a whole equation that God's working on. But we don't see that because we're so narrow-minded and focused on what we want God to do in this situation. And God said, I'm concerned about this situation, but I'm concerned about this whole situation that involves so much more than just what we're narrowly looking at in our lives. And so over and over again, God provided. We see that, so for example, the Israelites escaped captivity in Egypt, only to face one of the challenges, and the greatest challenge in the desert. What was that? food. Water, thirst. And I mean, here's a bunch of nomads, thousands and thousands of people that have left Egypt. God answered their prayer. And I'm sure they had expectations. Oh, boy, we'll get out of Egypt, and man, this is going to be great. Boy, it's going to be wonderful. Promised land. But they're now just days out of Egypt. And they're complaining, they're griping, they're wishing they had the collard greens and the garlic and the onions and kale and cabbage, all this stuff back in Egypt. Boy, I wish we had that back again. And already forgetting what God had delivered them from. And so we see that over and over again, God provided supernaturally for his people. If God can provide for thousands of Israelites in the middle of a desert, I'm sure he can provide for you and me and take care of us. He can do that. Now, God's not limited to provide for you in the way that you think he should provide for you, but God will provide. I love the verse, I've yet to see the righteous forsaken, one of my favorite verses, or begging for bread. Now, you may not be eating T-bone all the time or filet mignon all the time, but you know what? Your belly will be full. And God will take care of you. You may not be in a Taj Mahal, but you'll have a roof over your head. And God will be caring for you and taking care of you. And what a blessing it is. That's Psalm 37, verse 25. But even with God's supernatural provision, the Israelites still complained. In the desert, they grumbled in the desert. Why? They longed for the food they left behind in Egypt. God had provided bread from heaven, enough for every day. And here's the problem why they complained. They wanted the provision a different way. I don't like this manna from heaven. I was expecting something else. And so now God's providing for them, but not in the way they wanted. Not in the way they were hoping. Not in the way they were thinking and expecting. And they griped and complained and bellyache and were upset because God didn't provide for them the way they thought they should be provided for. And so then they began to become anxious and upset and angry at God. And so even through that supernatural provision, so they long for the food in Egypt. Rather than complaining, ask God to provide for you in whatever way he deems fit. Don't have expectations. Let God do what God wants to do for you, and he'll far exceed your expectations, exceeding abundantly above all that you could ever imagine. I mean, it'll far exceed. It's sort of like the little kid that the candy store guy says, son, put your hand in the candy jar and get the candy. He didn't put it in there. Why? He wanted his dad's hand to go in. It's a lot bigger handful of candy than his own little hand. And listen, if you just say, God, allow whatever you deem fit, whatever your will is, whatever your plan is, whatever your purpose is, God, I want your will to be accomplished. I want your hand to scoop in the candy jar, because I know it'll far exceed whatever I'm expecting to come out of it. And God may give you what you like, but sometimes he'll send leanness of soul as a result of giving you what you want. Sometimes you better back off and say, God, I don't want what I want what you want. And Lord, give me a heart that only desires your will to be accomplished in my life. And so that's a prayer we ought to pray in our lives. And so they grumbled, they complained, they did all these things, got mad at God because God didn't do it the way they thought he should do it. So rather than sulk and cry about things not going your way, give thanks to God, because God is still God regardless of your situation. God is still God regardless of whether there's a delay. God is still God. If you still don't see God moving, he's still God. That's the God that we serve. And he's a good God. He's a good, and he's a wise God, which means what? He always does right. And he always does what's best for you and I. So thankfully, God is patient. Amen. God's gracious towards us so we can grow to trust him for who he truly is, not what we expect him to be. You know, relationships are challenged because of unfulfilled expectations that we have of each other. A husband goes into a relationship and his wife's not meeting his wife has unfulfilled expectations of a husband. All these unfulfilled expectations. We do the same thing with God. We go with these expectations of how we think God should solve this problem and fix this problem and solve this problem and take care of that problem. We have all these, and why don't we just trust God for who he is? Just trust him for who he is. No expectation. Just like a husband just loves his wife because of who she is. And a wife loves her husband just because of who he is. And we as Christians just love God, and we let God be who he is, and not put God on some expectation stand, say, God, if you do this and this and this, then I'll trust you. You do this and this and this, I'll love you. If you do this and this and this, I'll obey you. No, God, I'm just going to let you be God. And sometimes it's going to be things I don't like, I don't agree with, I don't understand, doesn't make sense. But God, I want you to be God. And I'm going to let you be that. And that's not easier. It's easier, I understand, to preach and to say it than to live it. But with a great, and God allows us to grow in that area. Tonight, I'd expect. Number 2. So I did number 1. Providence is God providing in ways you don't expect. Number 2, providence frees us from bitterness. Providence frees us from bitterness. Now, this is clearly seen in the message we saw this morning, the verse, and you can turn there if you like. It's in Genesis 50, verse 20. Great verse there. If you want to, and I'll quote it for us. But providence frees us from bitterness. Now, a lot of unforeseen things happen in our lives that disappoint us, unfulfilled expectations, things don't go the way we want, treated unfairly, unjustly, all those different things. We're all recipients of that, and sad to say, sometimes we're the ones that facilitate that to others. And none of us are perfect on either end of that scope there. But God said, I don't want you to get bitter. I don't want you to get bitter. And providence of God allows us to free us from bitterness. Here's what Joseph said. Verse number 20 of chapter 50, Joseph says, but as for you, and this is his brothers come, and he says to his brothers, as for you, my brothers, you thought evil against me. But God meant unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Now, if any man had a right to get even, it would have been Joseph. If any man had a right to hold a grudge, it would have been Joseph. If any man had a right to get bitter, we wouldn't have argued about what Joseph had. We'd say, if I was in your shoes, you're a better man. I would feel the same way. And I don't think we would begrudge him at all. But because Joseph understood the providence of God, now this is so important, he chose not to focus on the evil that was done and allow that to contaminate the promise of God. He focused on what? But God. But God, but God. He took his focus from the problem and put his focus on God, because God took what was evil and made it good. But it was God that made that transition. If you want to focus on the hurt, the problem, and the injustice, then you're going to what? You're going to self-destruct in bitterness. But if you realize the promise of God's at work and you focus on but God, focusing on God eliminates the bitterness in your heart. Because you're not focusing on the hurt, the evil. Evil's different than sin. Sin is something we do that hurts ourselves. Evil is sin sort of matured, if you would, or sin, expanded, where you do wrong, not just to hurt yourself, with the intention to hurt someone else. That's an evil person. Why? You're saying things to hurt them. You're doing things to hurt them. You're acting in a way to hurt them. That's evil. That's evil. And so God says his brothers were what? Evil. Their intention was to hurt their dad by saying he was dead. Hurt Joseph because they're jealous of him. Hurt. That was their evil. And Joseph could have focused on how evil and hurtful they were, and he would have been bitter. Or he says, I'm going to focus on God. But God. But God. And so whatever the evil is in your life, you can stay focused on that, or you can get next to the next two words that says, but God. Why? Because if you understand the promise of God, God was not surprised by the evil that was done to Joseph. Didn't catch him. Well, what's going on? They're throwing him in a pit down there. Oh, what in the world? What? Potiphar's wife, and now he's thrown in prison because she falsely accused him, and now he's in jail in a dungeon somewhere. What's going on? All of those evil acts and evil things, God knew. And God was going to use all of those things. God was going to use but God was going to use all those things. And what you meant for evil, I'm not focused on you. I'm not focused on the evil. I'm focused on God and the good. And then here's another great thought. This is a whole message you could preach from this as well, from this verse. But look what it says here. It says, but as for you, it says, but men unto good, to bring to pass. I like this. As it is this day. He wasn't stuck in the past. Well, look what you said, and look what you did, and look how you act. He wasn't stuck in the evil of yesterday. He says, but today's a different day. You know why? Because God, in his providence, has taken that bitterness out of my heart. You know why? Because I focused on God and what good God was going to do, even though I didn't see the good God was going to do. But I know God's wise. I know God's good. I know I was going to see it one day. And so I kept trusting God, and I allowed that bitterness not to take root in my heart. I allowed that bitterness not to take residence in my life. And he says, today I'm focused. Today's a new day. This day. I'm not looking at what took place yesterday. I'm looking forward. That's a great thought as well. And so he could have got bitter, but he focused on God. We get bitter because we doubt God's goodness. We don't see his invisible hand at work in our lives. We don't see the invisible hand of God. What's providence? It's the covert invisibility of God at work in our lives. And God sometimes will allow those evil, or always, he always allows things to come into our life, but he'll allow evil things to be a part of our lives, to allow that to be the working together of all things for good. I don't understand it. It doesn't make sense to me. But God is going to take what evil has been done to you. And if you focus on the God and the goodness of God and move from this day forward, you'll be a much better person because of the evil that was done to you. Because it caused you to focus more on God than on your problem. But if you focus more on your problem than God, then what? You allow the problem to cause you to self-destruct. So the problem is not the problem. The problem was you chose not to focus on God. You chose to focus on the evil that was done against you. And I'm not justifying the evil that was done against you. They'll stand for God for that. But guess what? He was betrayed by his brothers. He was lied about by Potiphar's wife, and said that he was immoral with his wife, and all these injustices. But God allowed all of those evil things to happen. But had those things not happened, the steps, meeting the guy in the prison, and this step and that step and all the things we looked at this morning could not have taken place in his life. And so if you really believe God is at work in your situation, you can just stand back and let God do whatever God wants to do. Whether you see it, understand it, or agree with it, you're going to stand back. It says, God, I know you're working. I know you're working. I know I want to see some action occasionally. I don't want to see some progress on occasion. I want to see something, God. You know, we are, and God knows that. But God says sometimes, like the book of Esther, God, when do you show up? God, where are you, God? Now, come on. Esther's a good woman, and God, and this is an evil plot, and they're trying to kill the Jews. And God, when I need you the most in my life, God, where are you? I'm not there for you to see. I'm there for you to trust that I'm there in the details behind the scenes, working every detail out in your life. And so, number one, it makes us realize he often shows up unexpected, does things unexpectedly. Number two, it prevents us from becoming bitter. Then may I say, thirdly, on this thought, is this one here, is the promise of God also not only frees us from bitterness, I'm getting my page here, I got mixed up. It also gives us a new perspective on our tragedies. It gives us a new perspective on life's tragedies. Now, we won't turn there for the sake of time, but the not so good without God's perspective is seen in Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 18. Their father's dead. The brothers of Joseph feel like maybe Joseph was only kind to them because Daddy was alive. Daddy's dead now. And so they're what? Walking in fear. Because now maybe they're going to get back what they gave to Joseph. Joseph's going to do to them magnified and manifold ways. Because Joseph is in a position of great power now, they're afraid of what he might do to them. But there's a good example of how we perceive the not so good in our lives apart from God's perspective. When you fail to grasp God's purpose at work in our lives, it's easy to be ruled by fear, especially concerning your past sins or sufferings and sorrows you went through. Because you're looking at life without the providential, detailed God working in all the details of what was going on. Now, when you look at the not so good of things from God's perspective, Genesis 50, verses 19 to 21, you look at the flip side of the coin, listen how Joseph, a man guided by God's perspective, responds to his brothers. In verse 19, and Joseph said unto them, fear not, for am I in the place of God? But as for you, our verse we read, God, you meant evil, but God meant good. God took a host of not so good things, along with all sorts of other apparent coincidences and instances of clear divine intervention, and worked them all out together for good. And that's what Joseph will say, fellas, I'm not mad at you, because I've not been focused on you these last several years. I've been focused on God and waiting for God to do something good. And God has done something good. Reconciliation's taken place. I got to see my dad again. I got to see the family again. I got to see him again. And now we're going to be safe from the famine. It's going to be all right. And so God was able to do good. But he waited for God to do the good. But the power of God's providence is trusting that he's working when you can't see that God's working. And may I say, in those that you're most concerned and caring about, he's working. He's working. He's working. And that child that you're worried or concerned about, or that loved one you're anxious about, or that unsaved loved one that you're so down, heartbroken about, God is working. You preacher, I don't see it. They're so unkind and they're so rough around the edges. And only it's God working. God's working. God's working. Trust God. Let the power of God's providence go to work, because God's providence is working. Don't get in the way of what God is doing in their lives. And so we see that God gives us a different perspective. Think about it for a moment. A devastating car accident. A young woman's years of infertility, a bitter divorce, chronic health issues, a job loss, death of a loved one, a crippling addiction, financial struggles, a lack of vocational advancement, rejection and ridicule by your own peers. What do these all have in common? They're painful, they're difficult, they're tragic, but they're also, all of them, things that God can work together for good. All of them. Because in each of these, in some of these is us. I maybe didn't list something there that you've gone through, that you're going through, but God can work it for good. God can work it for good. And many of us can give testimony, he's done just that. As tragic and hurtful and painful as it was, the providence of God has worked out all the details in my life. Yes, life's hard. But make no mistake about it, God is good. And those statements are true all the time for God's children, because when we get to heaven, we'll look back over our pathway of life and see that through all the twists and turns of all the seemingly detours of life, God made no mistakes. God made no mistakes. And then last one, I'm done. Just 5 minutes, I'm done. Providence enables me to trust God's timing. Providence enables me to trust God's timing. We live in a fast-paced world where everything waiting is a challenge. But God's timing is always perfect. Abraham and Sarah waited 25 years for the son that God had promised to them. Moses spent 40 years in the wilderness before leading the Israelites out of Egypt. David waited 15 years after being anointed to be king before he ever became king. Joseph endured 13 years in slavery and in prison before rising to become the second most powerful man in Egypt. Hannah, who desperately longed for a child, waited patiently and prayed fervently, and God provided a son in Samuel. These are heroes of the faith that kept trusting God, kept obeying God, kept depending upon God, even in the years, not days, not months, weeks, and not months, years of waiting. And they understood what? God, the only thing that could keep their head above water at that time was to believe that God, you got to be working behind the scenes, God. Because I can't go another day if I don't believe you're behind the scenes working. I can't trust another day, God. I can't go on another day. God, I got to believe. I got to know. You've got to be working behind the scenes. If not, there's no reason to live another day, to wake up another day. But you know that God's working. And so that gives you what? A reason to wait those many years until you see the goodness of God experienced in your life in that way. Man's goings are of the Lord. The Bible says, how can a man then understand his own way? You see, when God directs your path, He sometimes leads us in a way that doesn't make sense. So we're not always going to understand everything. And so we try to reason out everything. We try to experience every struggle and confusion and misery. And there's a better way. Trust in the Lord with all thy heart. Lean not on thine own understanding. In all thy ways, acknowledge Him. He'll direct your path. Listen, we've got to trust God. The timing of God is always right. The timing of God is always perfect. That's what makes the promise of God so amazing. Because God always shows up just on time. And it's usually not the expected time I was expecting. Well, God, I thought you'd show up. Remember Lazarus? Well, you're late. No, I'm right on time. No, well, he died. He's dead. Lazarus, we buried him. He's gone. You're late, Jesus. I'm never late. Because the miracle that I'm going to do is the unexpected. Remember, the providence of God's unexpected. You want me to come and pray over him and heal him from his sickness. He says, I'm going to do something far greater. Lazarus, come forth. And there he came, bound up with all those grave claws, walking out right. And he did something far greater. The promise of God. Don't you limit God's power of His providence by taking things in your own hands. And say, well, I just don't see God working. I just don't see God doing what He's supposed to do, so I got to do something. Well, there may be a time for that, but more times than not, it may be just backing up and says, God, I know you're working. And even though I can't see it and doesn't understand, I know you're working. Esther, where's God? Where's God in this story? People are going to die. He's going to be hung on gallows unjustly, and all this corruption and evil is taking place. God, where are you? God is there. Well, you can't see His name. You won't find His name, but you'll find the providential, invisible hand of God. It's there. His fingerprints are in the pages of your life. He said, but preacher, where's God? Where's God? You may be this season right now where, like Esther, you don't see the name of God. You don't see Him working. But tonight your preacher is trying to encourage all of us to say, when you don't see Him, trust that the invisible hand of that Almighty God, the providential hand of God, it is working. It is working. And don't sabotage and don't short circuit the power of God's presence. So here's what we're to do. Submit your ways to the Lord. Submit your heart to the Lord. Submit your will to the Lord. Trust His timing. It allows you to rest in the assurance that He is working all things for His glory and for our ultimate good. Why? God, providence. Number one, God is sovereign. That means He's all powerful. He controls everything. He's sovereign. But that's just not if that's all it was, He's all controlling. But God's control is controlled by what? But I'm wise. Which means what? Everything that I do under what I control, it's always right. It's always right. And He says, I'm good. Which means it's always in your best interest. It's always in your best interest. But you've got to embrace the providence of God and not stiff-arm God and says, God, if I don't see you working, then I'm not. Wait a minute. God is working. Just give Him the time. You say, I've been giving Him the time. 25 years, Abraham and Sarah. 40 years, Moses. 15 years, David was anointed king but didn't take the throne until 15 years later. Joseph, 13 years in slavery. Hannah. These are heroes of the faith because they trusted God's timing even when the plans were unclear. Oh, I'll tell you what, the providence of God, it should give us a comfort that when we don't see and don't understand and can't hear, we can rest in peace that passes all understanding. Says, you know what? Honey, I know God's working. I know He's working. Church, I know He's working in your life. I know it's a hard time right now. I know it's a rough road you're going through right now. A lot of worries. I know it's tough. But folks, God's working. Just keep trusting. Keep trusting. Keep doing right. He's working. And let the power of the providence of God do what only the providence of God can do. And you'll see a miracle. That's what miracles are made of. When God shows up in unexpected ways and does something amazing in your life. Father, thank you for these people.